Hi guys, it's time for part 2 of our climate change journey, and today we'll have a deep dive into CO2. Virtually every scientist agrees that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and it makes our climate warmer. You might think the science is settled, so why do I even need to watch that video? Well, the question is the impact. Maybe it's too small, and the reason why temperatures are rising is a combination of natural causes and human activities like recent deforestation and expansion of agriculture. Can humans impact the climate without CO2? Well, there is an amazing country where people did it, and it's called Haiti. Poor people were allowed to settle whenever they want and build houses from trash and neighboring wood. The unoccupied land which nobody wants is usually on the hills. They cut the forest there and built these ugly favela districts. The poverty quickly multiplied and growth of this became uncontrollable. The main problem here is that forest on the hill keeps the moisture and soil together. If there are no trees and there is a bit of rain, it can create a big flood, washing out the fertile soil and making a landslide. This permanently destroys agriculture, demolishes people's houses and kills a bunch of people. This is exactly what happens in Haiti quite regularly. Man-made climate change, which has nothing to do with CO2. Haiti is located on the island Hispaniola, which is a home for another country called Dominican Republic, which is not the best country to live in, but is exponentially better than Haiti. When you have another hurricane and crisis in Haiti, Dominican Republic usually is doing 10 times better in terms of casualties. If you look at Google Maps satellite view, you can even see the difference between colors across the border between these countries. It's one of the examples where climate change respects political borders. Another good example is Israel and Syria, or Israel and Lebanon. You can see a very similar pictures on Google Maps. Before Israeli independence, the situation was different, and it was quite a neglected, shitty land, basically a desert. Jewish settlers transformed it over time, and now it's an extremely fertile place. This is a positive example of how people transform the climate for the better. Now let's look at the main source of truth, the IPCC 6 assessment. You have the graph which represents their model of global warming. Here you have a blue graph which gives you the simulation of temperature change if there were only natural causes. And it tells you that the temperature would have been pretty much the same. Then there is a model of simulation with human factors, which is a red graph, showing us that the temperature is rising and it's solely because of human activities. Then there is a black graph, which is the actual observed temperature. What's wrong with that? Well, basically everything. First of all, natural causes are defined as solar and volcanic activities. According to IPCC, everything else is irrelevant. If you watch the first part of that video, you know that the temperatures around 1000 AD were quite warm and most of the European glaciers were melted. Then there was an extended cold period centered around 1600 AD, which recreated most of the glaciers, which were melted again during the last 100 years, and there is a scientific consensus on that. We kind of know that solar and volcanic activities are not responsible for warmer climate around the year 1000 AD, nor it was CO2, which remained pretty much the same. There must be complex natural reasons to explain that phenomena. IPCC completely ignores that fact and shows us the graph which reminds us of the hockey stick, telling that the temperature was pretty much constant before Industrial Revolution. Again, I explain why this is completely wrong in the first part, which you should watch if you didn't. If you don't have time, the current scientific consensus is that scientists can reconstruct temperatures up to 1600 AD quite accurate. From 1000 AD to 1600 AD, there is a way less confidence in reconstruction, and there are particular places on Earth which shows greater or similar temperatures to the current one. And everything from 0 to 1000 AD is not possible to reconstruct with any kind of reasonable confidence. Basically, the hockey stick represented by IPCC only makes sense from 1600. Everything else is non-scientific, manipulative bullshit. Let's return to CO2. Another issue with that graph is human factors. You might naturally think that these include deforestation and extensive agriculture. Nope, this is an IPCC dirty manipulation. There is another graph which explains you the definition of human factors. These are greenhouse gases and aerosols. The first one warms the planet, the second one cools it down. Nothing about deforestation. Main offenders here are CO2 and methane. What is striking is that methane is almost as bad as CO2 according to IPCC, meaning that cows' farts are equally bad as jets' emission. And it is much easier to make society to eat less red meat than significantly reduce carbon emission without destroying the whole economy. Yet everyone talks about CO2 emission reductions and nothing about methane. Next issue, and the most important, the model. If you look a bit closer, it doesn't really predict things well. Black and red graphs are not really aligned, meaning that there are many things that they don't understand or account for. Next thing, it's not like they really invented this model like 50 years ago and predicted the current temperatures. And this is the proof that the science is quite sane and correct. Quite the opposite. They made the model which predicts what we already know, and they have to update that model every 5 years, otherwise it simply won't work. Now, how did they come up with that model? Well, there is no reference to any scientific paper or any genius scientist who made this breakthrough. They claim it's CMIP6 model simulation. Basically, there is an IPCC made model called CMIP6, which is supposed to use all the available knowledge and predict the temperatures based on the level of CO2 and other factors. Why this is correct? What are the assumptions of this model? This is something really outside of the scope of IPCC report. You can't find this information even in the technical part. What is the most weird for me is there is no physical explanation of how CO2 greenhouse effect actually works. Think about that the most important process on which the whole global warming theory is based on is not explained in this very lengthy IPCC report. Instead, they refer to the magical simulation of CMIP6 model. That reminds me of the Bible, which claims that the sun is rotating around the earth, and when in 16th century Copernicus made a simpler theory showing that it is actually earth who rotates around the sun, the theologian Martin Luther said the following: "The fool wants to turn the whole art of astronomy upside down. However, as Holy Scriptures tells us, so did Joshua bid the sun to stand still and not the earth." There is no way we can objectively criticize the Bible or that model, so we have to figure out on our own how things work. Sometimes in real life, some climate activists approach me and ask me, "How dare you not to believe in CO2 warming?" And I love to troll these guys and ask the simplest question: what is the percentage of CO2 in our atmosphere? And their answer is usually, "I don't remember, I need to look it up." And I was like, what is your guess? You must have a guess since you care a lot about global warming. By the way, you can post that video and try to guess this as well and put the answer in the comment. Usually climate activists refuse to guess, and then I give them the hint by telling them that the most common gas is nitrogen, the second most common gas is oxygen, which is 21%, and the third most common gas is CO2. Finally, they're making their guesses, and the answer I usually get is in range from 2% to 5%. Then I reveal the correct answer of 0.41%, and they're getting very mad. To confuse normal people, IPCC uses ppm instead of percentages, which means particle per million. Climate activists usually know that we have 410 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere, but they're too dumb to know what this actually means. Okay, what was the level of CO2 before industrialization? Well, 0.28%. So we are talking about 0.13% of change in the atmosphere, which made our planet much warmer. You can add methane, which grew from 0.08% to 0.18% and get another 0.1 increase, but I definitely need a proof of how this small amount of gas can make such a big difference in climate. Many people think that CO2 is some kind of a toxic gas hidden in sacred fossil fuels which kills everything alive when emitted. The reality is totally opposite. If you ask a normal person how the tree is being made, the answer probably would be you mix a fertile soil with water and use sun energy to transform that into a tree. If that theory was true, there would be a hole under the tree of eaten soil, but as you know, there is pretty much the same amount of soil as it used to be. And the reality is that tree is simply capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and making a chemical reaction with the water using sun energy. Basically, CO2 is a building block for all plants, and humans and other animals eat these plants to build their own bodies. If you remove water from any organic life, what is left is a bunch of transformed CO2. So CO2 is a completely safe gas for humans unless its concentration is over 5%, which is 5000 ppm. We are extremely far from that value. Now, let's look at the fossil fuel. What is it made of? There is a common religion that these are sacred and belong to the earth, and humans are not allowed to dig them and not to disturb the natural balance. In reality, coal is nothing more than a bunch of ancient dead trees. 400 million years ago, life was mostly present in the ocean, but then the planet started to be colonized by the trees. Right now, if the tree dies in the forest, you have a specific mushrooms which helps it to decompose and release CO2 back to the atmosphere. 400 million years ago, there was no such mushrooms and all the carbon was left on the land, creating more and more layers over time, eventually creating coal under the pressure and time. Basically, coal is a deposit of stolen CO2 from the atmosphere and humans are returning it back. That obviously means that the level of CO2 was much higher 400 million years ago than it is now. It is estimated that it was at 4,000 ppm at the beginning of the Devonian period. Then, after repeated extraction by plants, it dropped to 400 ppm, which is roughly the current level. Then the climate got colder and mass extinction of species happened around 360 million years ago. The reason for that horrible event was the dangerously low level of CO2. For example, if the level drops as low as 200 ppm, no photosynthesis is possible, meaning plants can't be grown at all. Basically, by digging out fossil fuels, humanity saved the planet from another mass extinction. Not surprisingly that all trees are optimized for much higher CO2 values. There is a clear scientific evidence that trees achieve optimal rate of growth when CO2 is around 1000 ppm. Basically, CO2 is a super fertilizer. The most puzzling thing about the Devonian period is that how is it possible that CO2 concentration was 10 times higher than the one right now, yet the Earth hadn't transformed into lifeless desert as some prophets of doom predicts. Quite the opposite, the biomass on the Earth was at all times high. Probably the conditions were not ideal for modern humans, but we are talking about 4000 ppm. The current prophets of doom tells us that irreversible changes will happen already at 600 ppm. This doesn't make much sense. Another ridiculous example when CO2 is being stolen out of the atmosphere are seashells. These are made of CO2 and calcium, and there is no way they decompose naturally. All limestone and dolomite mountains are made of dead shellfish from millions of years ago. If you drop your oyster shell in the ocean, it will stay there forever, contrary to plastic bottles which will eventually decompose. But nobody calls that a violation of nature. Now, let's look at the actual temperature changes since 1979 based on satellite evidence of the lower troposphere. We'll look at this briefly in the first part of the video. The biggest problem is asymmetry. The north is getting much warmer than the south and some parts of Antarctica are actually getting colder. Some of you might say, well, all the CO2 emissions are happening mostly in the northern hemisphere simply because most of the world population live there. And well, there is a map of CO2 concentration by place from 2011, and indeed it is much worse in the north, but the problem is that the most red color here is 395 ppm and the most blue color is 388 ppm, which is a negligible difference, and that theory completely fails. What are the other explanations? Well, there must exist another climatic process which is as powerful as CO2, which is able to counteract CO2 temperature increase in Antarctica and reverse that process back. What can it be? Scientists have no clue. It can be a change in ocean currents caused by some processes which we don't currently understand. The most important thing is that there is something at least as equally powerful as CO2 which can change the climate at the global scale. Now we are ready for the most scientific part, how the CO2 greenhouse effect actually works. As I told you, IPCC report contains no details, just refer to the magical model CMIP6. So it's one of the cases where Wikipedia is more scientific and useful than that crap. So what is the greenhouse effect? We kind of know what it is and kind of don't. The easiest way to explain this is your car. When you close your car on a sunny day and leave it for a while, the temperature inside is insanely hot. The way it works, you have a bunch of visible light coming from the sun into the car's window. In physics, it's called waves of the visible spectrum. Your window is made in the way to let these waves pass through it. Some of the waves are invisible, the super short ones called ultraviolet and the long ones infrared. The trick is that your window treats non-visible light differently. For UV light, it absorbs it. The easiest way to visualize it is to imagine that your window is black. For the infrared, it reflects it, so you can imagine that you have a mirror instead of a window. Now, what happens next? All the visual light is coming through the window and goes to your seat, which is in my case black. Black consumes the light waves and makes seat warmer. Then, since the seat is hotter than the rest of the air, it starts to emit infrared waves which flies at random directions. When the wave hits into the glass, it gets reflected because it's like a mirror, and potentially the wave can land back to the seat and transform it back into the heat. And the process repeats. Basically, the visible light is being transformed into infrared and being trapped inside the car. Luckily, there are still ways for heat to escape, otherwise the car would become indefinitely hot and explode. For CO2, it is slightly different. It works like a glass for all the visible light and let it go through, but it has some wavelengths of infrared which it blocks either fully or partially. By blocks, here I mean that the molecule takes the wave, gets excited and re-emits slightly different infrared waves into a random direction. So 50% of the chances it goes up to the atmosphere and potentially escapes, and 50% of the chance it will go back to the Earth and hits something again. Now, some real science. The sun has spectrum, meaning it emits a bunch of different wavelengths at different intensity. This includes visible and invisible ones. The yellow bar on the picture is that spectrum. As you can see, the majority of the waves are within the visible range, with some minor amount of short UV and long IR lights. The red bar on the picture is the spectrum that you will observe at the sea level, basically after everything filters out from the atmosphere. As you can see, you've got much less of the waves at the end, and it's not uniformly. There are a bunch of pockets and some of the ranges are completely blocked. Among interesting things, you can see that the shortest UVC range is being completely blocked by ozone, which is O3. Then you can see a bunch of HO2 related pockets, and there is only one with CO2. To be clear, all these pockets are cooling the Earth, not warming it. This is so-called aerosol effect. Now let's look at more exciting graph. Here blue shows what Earth is emitting back to the space, which is exclusively infrared. To understand how it works, you have a bunch of waves coming from the sun. Then some of them are being filtered by the atmosphere and reflected back to space. Some other will be consumed by objects on Earth, transforming waves into heat and then to infrared waves and sending them back to atmosphere. Then the atmosphere lets some of the waves escape and some other will be bounced back to the Earth. As you can see, most of the heat escapes through infrared window around 10 micrometers. Who is that bad guy not allowing heat to escape in most of the spectrum? If you think it's CO2 or methane, you are wrong, because this is H2O, which is water. Here is how H substance currently blocks H specific range. CO2 and methane look quite irrelevant compared to H2O. What is this H2O doing here? IPCC has never mentioned water as an aerosol or greenhouse gas. And well, water is not really a gas, but some free-flying molecules. How many of them do we have? Well, it depends. It can be from 0.2% to 4% in the atmosphere, depending on the global weather. And it's really hard to predict or model that. And the picture of the spectrum that we have is taken on the cloud-free day with some kind of stable humidity. If humidity is different or you have clouds, the picture will be completely different. Nonetheless, CO2 and methane clearly have a very secondary role to H2O. Let's try to find out this role. Let's look at the three windows where the heat escapes and see how CO2 and methane interfere with it. For CO2, these small chunks are irrelevant because they don't interfere with the escaping heat. That big chunk looks scary, but inside of it, it's irrelevant for the same reason. The only interesting things are the margins. The left one interferes with the largest chunk of heat, but water still plays a much bigger role here. The right margin has less power because most of it already been blocked by the water and the whole window is tiny. For methane, there is one place where it affects the heat window, and water interference in that place is quite small, which means that the block is quite real, although it's again at the end of the heat window, so the number of heat which can potentially be blocked is limited. You don't need to hold a degree in physics to understand that the moderate increase in these gases won't close the window for heat to escape. Scientists surprisingly agree with that, and all the models and apocalyptic scenarios assume that with the increase of CO2 and methane, there will be a very minor increase in temperatures, which leads to more water in the air, and the water will be a greenhouse gas which creates most of the global warming. That theory now makes sense because water is the strongest greenhouse gas. As we know from previous video, warmer temperatures creates more precipitation. But there is one huge problem. If you have too much water in the air, it can form clouds. Clouds are tricky. They block heat from escaping from the Earth, but also they reflect the sun energy and blocking the visible light to coming to the Earth. So at the end, they are kind of providing some kind of cooling effect, meaning that more water in the air doesn't necessarily lead to warming. To be able to simulate this kind of processes, you need to have a very good model which can predict cloud formation over time. These models are extremely complex and they don't really work. As you know, science can't make a proper weather forecast even for today. They can't predict general weather for the upcoming year and tell us whether it will be colder or hotter and why. This is just really hard and outside of human capabilities at the moment. Now, IPCC tells us that we need to believe in their model, which uses the simulation of the cloud and all the best climate knowledge available, which is probably true, but neither this model knows how to simulate cloud properly, nor it does account for deforestation and agriculture, which surely changes the pattern of infrared lights being emitted from the Earth. That doesn't look like a settled science to me, but rather an attempt to explain something which we don't know with the current state of the science with simple theories of CO2 and methane emissions. And don't get me wrong, I believe that greenhouse gases have some impact on the climate, but it's only part of the game. Unfortunately, IPCC tell us someone's opinion instead of real scientific facts. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe and drop some comment, tell me what you think, and see you next time. Bye!